Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you're having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is a pro-revenge story. About 6 or 7 months ago, my neighbor got a drone. I don't mind people having hobbies, but for some reason he insisted on flying like the biggest jerk possible. He would hover in front of other houses and windows, try to race cars going down the road, and worst of all, he had a habit of flying his drone in my fenced backyard, buzzing over my dog, diving low just over my dog's head before circling around to do it again. My dog isn't small. He's about 70 pounds and a Malamute, but the drone terrified him, and I was worried about what would happen if it hit him. I asked my neighbor several times to please not fly in my yard and explained that it was scaring my dog. He basically told me to get lost and laughed in my face. When it still continued, I called the police. Unfortunately, there wasn't much they could do other than ask him to please not fly over my house property. Finally, in late December, it happened. My dog got tired of his crap and managed to catch the drone right as it was diving towards him. He shredded the drone. The thing was just a jumbled mess of wires and plastic. Neighbor was pissed. He stormed over to my house, swearing and threatening me, which I ignored. A week later, I got a summons to small claims court. He wanted $900 for the cost of his drone and an additional $300 for supposedly denying him access to his property. The drone sat in my yard for a couple of hours before it was retrieved. Duck that. He could have killed my dog. I don't have kids or a girlfriend. I just have my dog, who is my best friend for the past 7 years. That dog has moved with me 3 times. Was there when I graduated college, saw me buy my first house and my first new car. I love my dog. Went to legal advice, got some great help from them. Turns out, him suing me was the best thing to ever happen. When we got to small claims court, the judge basically laughed away his claims that I had intentionally trained my dog to attack his drone. But little did he know I was prepared. I had dozens of photos of my yard showing it was impossible for him to accidentally fly that low to my dog, videos of him harassing my dog in the past, and I had saved all my medical bills from taking my dog to the vet. $700 for an x-ray? Check. Another $250 to sedate him during? Why not? Don't want him being uncomfortable. Full dental exam with tooth cleaning repair? $400. Then there was the cost of anti-anxiety meds and a secondary checkup, wet food for a week in case his teeth were hurt, and extra just for good measure. In the end, the a-hole ended up owing me almost $2,000 and now is being investigated by the FAA for not having a registered drone and violating several FAA regulations concerning drone flight. Too near an airport, too close to other people, out of sight of operator and way above the maximum altitude. Enjoy never being allowed to fly drones again, idiot. The next one is an entitled people story. Hi there, my name is Alex and I recently experienced a terrible ordeal that I never thought would happen to me. I live in a cozy apartment in the heart of the city, and it's a place I've called home for years. One day I decided to go on a long vacation to Europe with my best friend, leaving behind all of my belongings and the security of my home. I felt safe leaving my apartment because I had arranged for a close friend, Mark, to look after my place while I was gone. Mark is someone I've known since childhood, so I trusted him completely to take care of my things and keep the apartment safe. Before leaving for my trip, I made sure to write out a detailed checklist for Mark, so he knew exactly what was expected of him while I was gone. The list included instructions on how to water my plants, what to do if there was an emergency, and how to take care of my pets. As the days passed and I was having the time of my life in Europe, I tried to reach Mark to check in on things, but to my surprise, he was never available to answer my calls or texts. I assumed he was just busy with his own life, so I didn't worry too much about it. Finally, the day arrived when I was supposed to return home. I was ecstatic to see my apartment again and to be back in my own space. But when I arrived, I found the front door was locked, and I couldn't find my keys anywhere. I rang the doorbell and waited, but no one answered. That's when I heard a faint sound of movement inside the apartment. I was confused, but I tried not to panic. As I waited, I saw police cars pull up to my building. I thought it was strange, but I didn't think much of it until I saw Mark come out of my apartment with a smug look on his face, followed by the police. They came over to me and started asking me all kinds of questions, and I couldn't understand what was happening. Mark had told the police that I was a squatter trying to break into his apartment, and he had even gone as far as to change the locks on my front door. I couldn't believe it. I tried to explain to the police that I was the rightful owner of the apartment, but they didn't believe me. I was so angry and hurt that Mark, someone I had trusted with my life, would do this to me. I decided to take matters into my own hands and hired a lawyer to help me get my apartment back. After weeks of legal battles and going back and forth with Mark and his lawyer, I finally won my case. However, my victory was short-lived. A few weeks after getting my apartment back, I noticed that some of my belongings were missing. At first, I thought I might have misplaced them, but as I looked around the apartment more closely, I realized that someone had broken in and stolen my things. I was devastated. I had lost some of my most valuable possessions, including family heirlooms that I had inherited from my grandparents. I knew that I couldn't let this go, so I contacted the police and reported the theft. The police investigated the crime, but they were unable to find any evidence that would lead them to the thief. I was frustrated and angry, but I didn't give up. I started doing my own investigation, talking to neighbors and reviewing security footage from the building. After several weeks of searching, I finally found a lead. One of my neighbors had seen a suspicious person hanging around the building on the day of the break-in. With this information, I went back to the police, and they were able to track down the thief and recover some of my stolen items. It was a huge relief, but I still had a lot of work to do to recover everything that was taken. I spent the next few months going to flea markets, antique shops, and pawn shops trying to find my stolen belongings. It was a grueling process, but I was determined to get everything back. Eventually, I was able to track down most of my stolen items, and I felt a sense of relief and closure that I had never felt before. However, just as I thought everything was behind me, I received a call from the police. They had arrested Mark for stealing my belongings. It turns out that he had been the one who broke into my apartment and stole my things. I couldn't believe it. The person who I had trusted the most had betrayed me in the worst way possible. Mark was sentenced to jail time for his crimes, but it didn't bring me the closure that I thought it would. I was left feeling violated and vulnerable, knowing that someone I had trusted had taken advantage of me in such a terrible way. It took me a long time to regain my sense of security and trust in others. As for my apartment, I decided to make some changes to ensure that nothing like this would ever happen again. I installed a state-of-the-art security system, changed all of the locks, and made sure to only trust people who I knew for certain were trustworthy. It was a difficult lesson to learn, but one that I would never forget. The next one is a petty revenge story. I work in data analysis for financial firms in Europe. I recently got a new line manager from America. While I usually get along well with my American colleagues, this guy is an asshat. I'm not sure how he got promoted to his position, as he knows nothing about the industry. I often have to present to the board, and he always goes through my slides beforehand and asks me questions about them. He then asks purposefully challenging questions about things he's only just learned from me 5 minutes before the meeting. It's really dickish behavior. Once I realized what he was doing, I started being more careful about how much I shared. One time, I managed to plant questions that made him look stupid in front of the board. Following this, he made me present to him beforehand, and then he would take my presentation and deliver it himself to take the credit. This really pissed me off, so I took my petty revenge. For the next meeting, I included a few slides in the PowerPoint that were not connected to the presentation. I was able to quickly skip through these when I was going through it with him, so he didn't pick them up. However, once he got to the meeting, the fun began. The board was very surprised to see a picture of a baby kangaroo in the middle of the projected Q3 earnings. He got flustered and blundered through the next few slides. He was just getting back on track, but then the regional analysis appeared on the bare chest of Tom Brady. The board was getting visibly annoyed at this point, and they thought he was joking around. It all settled down until the final slide, which was the standard, "Any questions?" Only the faded picture in the background just happened to be a bikini pic of the CEO's daughter taken from her Instagram. How did that get there? Asshat quickly made his apologies and left. He came gunning for me, so I had to play ignorant. I don't know how that happened. It was all fine when we went through it before. Must be a hacker. Luckily, Sergeant Craphead bought this excuse as he knows nothing about anything. The board, however, weren't so forgiving, and they immediately transferred him to a more junior position. 6 months later, I got promoted to the role he had vacated. The next one is an entitled people story. Okay, so this isn't a recent story and it occurred during the pandemic. A few things to note. My next-door neighbor is the wealthiest person in the neighborhood as far as we know. Before the pandemic, he was a reasonable guy and I never had a problem with him, save one party that got a little out of control. But for context, I will start this story before that day. This neighbor, who we will call Jack, lives in the house next door to mine with his long-term girlfriend. Let's call her Stacy. She's a gem of a person. Since before my father-in-law gave his house to my wife, he would hold crazy parties at his house. These parties would happen every weekend. He invited us to one when we moved in, and we went to be polite, but it wasn't our thing, so we politely declined. He was still a reasonable guy and would say, "Come on, we'll have a blast." But the wife and I would use our kids as an excuse and politely decline. He converted the first floor of his house into a nightclub, complete with an indoor swimming pool. One party will always stick out to me as the day we saw a tow truck remove a car from a brick wall. The driver was okay, but the party itself was massive. It looked like he invited the entire town. The next day, he asked me if I would help him move a couch. The couch was thrown into the pool. I helped, and we had a laugh about it. As I said, even with some of the wildest parties, not a bad guy. He at one point helped me clear out some trees that fell in the woods behind our houses. It was the pandemic that caused him to go off the deep end. My town was spared the worst of the pandemic. The schools shut down before the orders from the state. Many businesses did the same. Jack, however, did not stop his partying. His parties were shut down several times until one day it looked like the entire police force showed up. They arrested everyone. They were all let go, but the parties were over and the good, fun-loving guy was gone. He organized a protest with his friends and got a bunch of others who hated masks and went to the town hall. It was closed and they tried the county office. For some unknown reason, they went after a supermarket and harassed the workers. I think it was on Facebook and YouTube, but I may be confusing it with other such protests. Why these people chose to harass grocery stores is beyond me. Well, he ended up getting arrested again. We were still on speaking terms at this point. That would change when he and a buddy of his decided to race their overpriced cars through town. We got into a heated argument about it, and he took offense when I pointed out that the only reason he isn't in jail is that he's rich. Not my proudest moment. More recent events include calling the police on anyone who is having work done on their house, calling the police when anyone parks on the street, sending lawyers to town hall to disrupt the meetings, and most recently, parking 10 junk cars on the street with flat tires, wrapping a chain around a piece of construction equipment, and putting up a very vulgar sign. Oh, and his girlfriend usually comes over to apologize for his actions. I am surprised that she hasn't broken up with him. She is the one to apologize for his actions and will offer to pay for any damages. They are still together from what I know, but I haven't seen her in a few weeks. My neighbor is the pinnacle of the entitled rich-a-hole, in my opinion. The next one is an entitled parents story. Last week, I was traveling for work. It had been a long 2 days of meetings, and I was exhausted. I had just arrived at the airport for my evening cross-country flight home when I got the dreaded text from the airline saying my flight was delayed 2 hours due to mechanical problems. I decided to pass the time by getting something to eat. I found an airport restaurant and sat down to order. I ordered my food and pulled my phone out of my bag to catch up on email and browse the web while waiting for my food to arrive. While I was waiting, a family with a mom, dad, a little girl about 5 years old, and a middle school-aged boy sat at a table near me. I didn't pay them much attention as I was looking at email on my phone, but then I heard the little girl exclaim in a rather loud voice, "Look, Mom, that lady is on her phone at the table." I then heard the mother reply, "Yes, she shouldn't be doing that. It is rude to have a phone at the table." I glanced over and the mother said to me, "We have a rule that no phones are allowed at the table." My first reaction was to say something snarky, as exhaustion was definitely getting the better of me. But then I thought better of it and decided to be polite. I looked at the little girl and said, "We have the same rule in my family, but since I'm here alone, I'm not being rude to anyone by looking at my phone now." At this point, the son looked like he wanted to crawl under the table from embarrassment, and the dad was trying to hand the mom a menu and said, "It's okay, let's just order." I thought that would be the end of it, but no. The mom said, "Obviously you have a family, so you know how important it is to follow rules. I would appreciate it if you would put away your phone," in a tone that a parent would use on a petulant teen. The little girl chimed in and said, Yeah, you have to put your phone away. My brother can't have his phone at the table, so you can't either. I looked at the little girl and said in as sweet a tone as I could muster, well, the great thing about being a grown-up is that I can do whatever I want, so now I'm going to keep looking at my phone, and turned back to my email. The mother sighed loudly, the teen looked even more embarrassed, and the dad again tried to get the mom to just order and leave me alone. The mom called the waiter over and asked to be reseated. He grudgingly moved them to a different table. My food arrived and I ate in peace, enjoying browsing Reddit. The next one is an entitled people story. I was born when my mother and father were only 17. It forced both of my parents to drop out of high school and each get a GED so they could find work right away. My father especially was not happy about this because he had dreams of playing football in college and instead, he had to work at a gas station. He said to my face many times that I ruined his dream. My mother hardly raised me at all as she had to work too. They had a cranky old lady next door watch me most of the time. She wasn't so bad. She gave me more attention than my parents did. My father eventually managed to land a better job as a manager due to his experience running the gas station. It was right after that my mom got pregnant with my sister. I was 6 when she was born. I wasn't shown much love before that. But once my sister came along, it was made pretty obvious, even to my 6-year-old self, that I was unwanted. The only ones who seemed to care were my paternal grandparents and my babysitter. They were more like my parents because they treated me the way a little kid needed to be loved. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment. As my sister got older, it went from me sharing a bedroom with her to me being kicked out of the room entirely. I slept on the couch for 2 years, and I barely had anything to my name other than clothes, school supplies, and an old Game Boy. When I was 10, my parents decided they were going to move away, but this move did not include me. I ended up being fine with this because my grandparents had agreed to take me in. My life was instantly better. I got my own room again, and my grandparents gifted me a brand new N64 in 1996. That Christmas, I got a Game Boy Pocket too. And there were a couple of other kids my age in the neighborhood I got to hang out with. We rode bikes, played video games, shot cans with pellet guns, built forts, and got dirty playing in the creek. You know, stuff a normal kid would enjoy. I was finally happy. As time went on, I grew up and eventually moved out. But later, I moved back in to help my grandparents' house as they were getting old and living off their retirement savings. So some rent money from me went a long way in paying the bills. My grandpa was the kind of person who wanted to build a bomb shelter during the Cold War but never got around to it. He wanted to volunteer for the military in the 60s but was turned down due to a medical condition and the fact that his eyesight was not great. So he focused on saving whatever he thought he needed. He told me many times it was better to have something and not need it than need it and not have it. Our area suffered from numerous power outages in winter due to heavy winds and storms. So having gasoline and propane for heaters and generators was a must. All these saving habits became my own as time went on, because it was better to need this stuff rarely than not have it at all. Of course, there was the HOA bothering us, but that's its own story. The problem is, about 5 years back, my grandma died suddenly, and my grandpa was heartbroken. He also went about a year and a half later. Pretty much everything they owned was willed to me. Their savings, their house, their vehicles, their stuff, everything. The house was long paid off, and Grandpa knew how to keep up with its maintenance. In fact, after Grandma died, he kind of doubled down on renovating the place. He had the roof redone, the house was repainted by us inside and out, and we fixed a lot of little things. Grandpa's neighbor George even came by to help redo the plumbing. Ironically, the HOA was rather happy with these changes because the house didn't look run down anymore. One morning I was fixing breakfast and my grandpa never came downstairs. You couldn't keep the man from his bacon, so I went to check on him and he wasn't moving. I called cops and paramedics came only to tell me he'd passed in his sleep. My parents made Grandpa's funeral a crap show. They didn't bother to show up for Grandma's. They were too busy. And at Grandpa's funeral, they didn't seem to grieve at all. My sister also showed up wearing a brightly colored designer dress, which I wasn't happy about as it was a church clothes-only function. I noticed my parents repeatedly whispering to each other and glaring at me whenever I looked at them. Come to find out at the will reading that my parents knew that they'd been disinherited long ago for their treatment of me, and they thought it extremely unfair I got everything, They threatened to sue me to contest the will, and I got repeated calls and messages from my father, mother, and sister telling me I needed to do the right thing and give my father what was supposed to be his. I told them all to flake off in far more unsavory words. My parents ended up taking me to court to challenge the will, but the judge ruled in my favor after seeing the will and hearing us both out. So it wasn't a long, drawn-out legal battle. The judge even looked at my parents with absolute disgust after seeing the will and hearing about their mistreatment of me in my childhood. He called my father a terrible parent and that my grandparents were right to disown him. My father just hung his head in silence, but he made sure to stop me outside the courtroom and tell me I was always the biggest mistake of his life, and that if he could go back in time, he'd make sure I never existed. He should have been a football star, and instead he has to wear a name tag for a 9 to 5. I told him that, mistake or not, Grandma and Grandpa could see what kind of nasty person he was. I didn't ask to be born, and the only real love I ever got was from my grandparents, and he was no father of mine anymore. I got a few more threatening and harassing phone calls, as well as some letters from my parents, all demanding money, among other things. But over time, they just stopped because I completely stonewalled them. I never responded to the emails or letters, and I stayed silent during the phone calls. A few times I just left the phone sitting on the counter with them ranting until they realized I wasn't listening. Aside from not getting the house or money, my parents seemed particularly irked they could not even get a rise out of me. But I was prepared to go to war against them, and they knew it, so in the end they just left me alone. From what I know looking at Facebook the past decade, my sister tried to get into modeling, got married, had 2 kids, got divorced, and is currently unhappily working a job she feels is beneath her. My mother currently works retail and is also vocal about her disdain for it. Like my father, she peaked in high school. She was a cheerleader back then and even had her old uniform framed on the wall. My father has pretty much had the same job for 25 years. He must be good at it if he's still doing it. As for me, well, I'm in my late 30s now, and I live pretty much debt-free in a nice neighborhood. I haven't really had a girlfriend since high school, and I've had little motivation to ever have another relationship. But loneliness gets to everyone. So maybe I'll try to find someone soon. Not many are in the financial position I'm in at my age. Single, paid-off house, 2 vehicles, and a decent amount in the bank. I guess I could aim to be a stepfather. That might be more my speed. Overall, I'm content with my life. I know that without my grandparents' love and support, I wouldn't be where I am today. They were the only ones who truly cared for me, and I will always be grateful for that. As for my parents, I have no intention of ever speaking to them again. They made their choices and they have to live with the consequences. And as for me, I'll continue to live my life on my terms, with the lessons I learned from my grandparents guiding me along the way. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already.